In the remote deserts of South Australia, a dark chapter of history unfolded, one that left scars on the land, its people, and generations to come. This is the story of Maralinga. In the 1950s and 60s, Britain, determined to cement itself as a nuclear power, sought a testing site. With the U.S. no longer sharing nuclear technology, it turned to its Commonwealth ally, Australia. Prime Minister Robert Menzies agreed, and Maralinga, deep in the Great Victoria Desert, was chosen. Why Maralinga? It was remote, out of sight from the public, and home to few. At least, that's what authorities claimed. But the land wasn't empty. It belonged to the Maralinga Churro Chop people who had lived here for thousands of years.
Between 1956 and 1963, Britain conducted a series of nuclear detonations with devastating consequences. Entire indigenous communities were displaced, often without warning. Those who remained suffered radiation exposure, leading to sickness, birth defects, and death. Efforts to warn local families were grossly inadequate. Walter McDougall, a lone patrol officer, was tasked with covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers to locate and evacuate indigenous residents. Many were left behind, unprotected from the fallout.
Maralinga is considered an act of war against Aboriginal people. But it wasn't just Indigenous people. Over 35,000 Australian servicemen were stationed at Maralinga, many unaware of the dangers of radiation. They too faced severe health complications in the years that followed. Both veterans and Aboriginal people faced devastating illnesses. Today, the land is still contaminated. Plutonium particles remain in the soil. Groundwater is tainted. This damage is irreversible. This impacts Aboriginal people whose traditional practices are tied to the land. Radiation continues seeping into groundwater, gradually spreading and building up in the ecosystem, affecting plants, animals, and ultimately the entire food chain. This gradual process has even contaminated the marine environment through gas exchanges in the ocean atmosphere.
The land itself was considered very radioactive and uninhabitable for decades following. The consequences of the testing followed for years to come, and it is thought to have disproportionately affected the indigenous Maralinga people, often unable to interpret the English warning signs listed throughout the site. Because of the lack of proper follow-up on the events, many of the negative effects that followed were not properly recorded. Though the initial contamination remains undocumented, a cleanup incident in 1990 occurred where tons of contaminated dust and fallout was dispersed throughout the area. It is estimated that the affected communities of this secondary incident would experience rates of cancer 10 to 130 excess cases higher per every 10,000 people.
Lotus family, those brother, and should be wearing a Maralinga.